Welcome to our ninth class in the study of the Gospel of Mark, studying the text of the Gospel of Mark, but also trying along the way to discover what Mark is saying about the specific theme of discipleship, what it means for us to walk the way of discipleship, what we are to know, the commitments that are necessary, the faith focus that is a part of a faithful walk, and what it means to learn and to live out the way of discipleship. For me, it has been an intriguing study. I have studied afresh the Gospel of Mark. I have presented to you a number of concepts that were in development, but I have now had the opportunity to bring them into a fresh description. I'm grateful that you have been able to be with us. We come today to study the last chapter, chapter 16, the story of the resurrection. It would perhaps appear that when we read the story of resurrection, that all of the problems that we have had with the disciples up to this point would be solved. But that is not the case. We're going to read the story of fearful and unbelieving disciples, and so let's develop that story together in chapter 16. The disciples have been absent for many of the events of chapter 15 surrounding the crucifixion. At the Garden of Gethsemane, they were scattered. Peter followed from a distance for a time, but that only set him up for the denial, which two denial stories then frame the story of Jesus' trial. So the disciples are absent, and they've been scattered despite their agreement and their affirmation that they would remain with him, that they would stay with him. They are absent. The text tells us that a group of Galilean women observed from afar, chapter 15, verse 40, observing the place of burial as well, chapter 15, verse 47, and that now they have arrived at the tomb on the first day of the week to anoint Jesus' body, chapter 16 and verse 1. Jesus has already been anointed, as we read in chapter 14 and verse 8. Not only has he already been anointed beforehand, but he has now risen. We read in chapter 16 and verse 6. That's what the women discover when they come to the tomb to anoint his body. And so we have a declaration of resurrection. The finality of the tomb is denied. The purpose of the journey that Jesus has made throughout the book of Mark has been realized. He has arrived at the goal, giving his life in order that he might find his life, that he might be raised, that he might be resurrected. He has demonstrated for us the way of discipleship, what it means to lose one's life in order that one might gain life. He has demonstrated to us what it means to be on the way, to be fully committed, giving his life as a ransom for many, chapter 10 and verse 45. And so with all of those pieces of the puzzle in place, the resurrection obvious, now the women are told, go tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus is going before them into Galilee just as he has said before, chapter 16 and verse 7. And we refer back to 14:28 to see that promise, to give a context to that statement. The Bible says then that the women flee and that they are afraid, even as all before had fled and were fearful, chapter 14 and verse 50. I don't want to spend time on the question of whether we should accept the short ending or the long ending of the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 16 and verse 8, with the fearful women, they were afraid, we have the short ending. But at least since the 2nd century, the longer ending of Mark has existed, accepted by the early church as an accurate telling of the story, giving more detail about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. And so whether we accept the short ending or the long ending, we could say that in the history of the church, beginning in chapter 9 to the end of the chapter, we have the rest of the story. It is a story that is consistent with the first part of the story. It's a story that continues to focus on the unbelief of Jesus' disciples. There are 3 appearances of Jesus from chapter 16, verse 9 to the end of the chapter. The first is to Mary Magdalene. She is the one who can tell the news to them, even as they are mourning and weeping. But the point is not about Mary Magdalene. The point is about they still will not believe. Second, he appears to two disciples. This is perhaps parallel to Luke 24, and they also go and tell the rest, but they still do not believe. Finally, Jesus appears personally to the 11, rebukes them for their unbelief, for their hardness of heart. We do not need to repeat here the study of the hardness of heart of the disciples. They had not believed, those who were witnesses. They had not believed the accounts that are related to us previously in the chapter, those who had seen Jesus after his resurrection. And here we are in the midst of their unbelief, and they are offered redemption. They are offered reconciliation. They are offered reinstatement. Indeed, good news for disciples today. In the midst of our frailty, in the midst of our fear, in the midst of our failure, in the midst of our lack of faith, even unbelief, Jesus offers to us redemption and reinstatement. You are my disciples. You are my followers. I send you into the world to proclaim the gospel. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Chapter 1 and verse 1, the confession of the centurion, a confession that we have met again and again in our study of the Gospel of Mark. Go proclaim the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of what it means to be a disciple, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to all creation. Those who are believers, those who believe the message, will be baptized, and they will be saved. Those who do not believe will stand condemned. In Mark's gospel, the question of discipleship is always a question of faith. Do you believe? And in the Great Commission of Mark's gospel, if you believe, you will be baptized. This longer ending of Mark appears in most of our Bibles today. It also speaks about confirming signs and wonders and briefly describes the ascension. And that brief description of the ascension would also be consistent with Mark's brief descriptions of Jesus' baptism and Jesus' temptation. In the last verse, the text notes that the preaching of the disciples was accompanied by the Lord working with them, and that the signs served to confirm their message. They went forth preaching the word. So we've read the story of Jesus, and it can also be our story if we want to be disciples. The way of discipleship, knowing fully, affirming Jesus as the Lord of our lives, giving ourselves gladly to him in full submission, wanting to see, learning and living the way of the Master, the way of discipleship, following him faithfully, even unto death. I realize that's not a popular view of discipleship. It's not what many want to hear, but it is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It is the gospel of the kingdom. It is the message that Mark shares with those to whom he is writing. Are we in the midst of fear? Are we in the midst of disbelief? The message of Mark, let us follow anyway. Let us follow Jesus wherever it may lead us. The last questions you're now familiar with. Questions of head, of heart, of hands, questions of understanding, questions of your feelings, questions of how you will respond. The Greeks understood these as the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. It's what we know, but it's also how we incorporate that knowledge into our emotional being, that we become committed, and that our will matches his will, that we go forth as disciples in the midst of our doubts, in the midst of our failures and our fears, that we too can be faithful witnesses of the message of Jesus Christ. If I can help you in any way as you seek to be a follower of Jesus Christ, I invite you and encourage you to contact me. Please know that I am praying that the message of Mark might fall on good and honest hearts, and that we might be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. Thank you for sharing this study. I invite you to one more study that will not focus on the text, but will be a review and a summary. We'll try to bring together all of these various accounts and one more time grasp the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. May God bless us as we strive to know and to understand and to faithfully follow in the way of the Master, the way of discipleship.